There is a popular legend that demonstrates the mania that infected the citizens of England during the South Sea bubble of the 1700s. It goes like this. The people had investment fever and it was bad. They wanted to invest in South Seas companies, sure, but they would put their money in just about anything. This included a business promoted by a man who described his endeavor as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Crazy. Or maybe not. These days, that sort of company is called a SPAC, and they're as popular as ever. Just ask DraftKings, or Nikola, or Virgin Galactic, or Veladine, or Utz, or Ilion. SPACs, or Special Purpose Acquisition Companies, are all the rage these days. For the uninitiated, these are companies whose sole purpose is literally just to buy another company and take it public. They don't sell goods or services, but they have a pile of money and intend to buy a company that does one of those things. For the company being bought, especially if they're smaller and less established, a SPAC might be appealing because the traditional IPO process may be unavailable to them. But where exactly did they come from? The ancestry of the modern SPAC doesn't really begin in 1700 England. Instead, it begins in seedy brokerage houses in the 1980s. This was an era of sleazy businessmen making a killing off the backs of the elderly and the gullible via penny stock scams. The Washington Post predicted in 1989 that the financial world would remember the preceding decade as one containing the, quote, most extensive outpouring of fraud, deception, and abuse directed at American investors since the speculative frenzy of the 1920s. A favorite tool of these scammers was the blank check company, a precursor to today's SPACs and whose name is far more self-explanatory. The deception would work something like this. Someone creates a business, and then they list their shares for sale to the public, where they almost entirely get purchased by related parties. These related parties can make the share price go up or down as they please, since they control the market. Later, when the company announces their acquisition target, cold callers from brokerages start pitching the acquisition to prospective buyers while the share price is manipulated upwards, reinforcing what the victims are hearing. Eventually, this FOMO farming pays off. The suckers buy shares at the top, and then the market collapses since there was never any actual buyers to begin. Regulators obviously did not like this and responded with the Penny Stock Reform Act of 1990, which eventually led to something called Rule 419. Rule 419 created several rules about penny stock blank check companies meant to protect investors, such as requiring the majority of funds that were raised to be placed in an escrow or trust, and capping the time that the company had to merger at 18 months. Interestingly, the new rules didn't apply to most legitimate blank check companies since they raised enough money that they exceeded the definition of penny stock. However, to the public, this distinction was too nuanced to matter. All blank check companies were guilty by association. Then, onto the stage stepped David Nussbaum. The chairman of GKN Securities recognized that although there was no requirement for larger blank check companies to follow Rule 419, they would never be able to raise funds successfully unless they adhered to those rules anyway. Plus, they'd avoid facing regulatory scrutiny of their own since they were effectively already regulated. The echo of his work is seen in modern SPAC filings, which have a section on how closely the security in question is adhering to Rule 419. Anyway, inspired by this, his team launched 13 blank check companies in the early 1990s, often with well-known managers to further contrast their new prestige from their seedy past. And it worked. 12 of them successfully acquired targets. GKN was so tied to this idea that they acquired a trademark on the name for the type of company that successfully pioneered. The SPAC, short for, trigger warning guys, Specified Purpose Acquisition Company. The results of SPACs from that era are underwhelming. It was difficult to find information, but I did uncover an article from 2005 by Aaron Elstein, which summarized even the performance of one of the relatively few success stories, Information Systems Acquisition Corp., offers little to excite investors. The company went public in 1993 at $6 a share and later merged with a closely held software company. It is now known as Neoware Systems Inc. and trades on the NASDAQ stock market. After trading for $1 a share for several years in the late 1990s, the stock perked up to $21 last year, but since has come down to about $8.50 a share. At current prices, the stock has generated a 43% gain over 11 years, one that compares poorly with the 160% rise in the S&P stock index over that same period. GKN let their trademark expire in 2000, which makes sense because at that time, the SPAC had effectively gone extinct. The absence of the SPAC occurred because smaller companies didn't need any help going public in the late 1990s. There was so much money being thrown around, especially at tech companies, that the front door to going public was wide open. Of course, easy money didn't last forever, and a few years later, SPACs were ready to make a comeback. This time, they were led by a company called Early Bird Capital, helmed by a chairman of the board whose name may sound familiar, David Nussbaum. Whatever happened to GKN Capital then? Well, remember how GKN worked to separate the SPAC from the spoiled reputation of blank check companies, the boiler room operations that would manipulate stock price? Here's the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority's summation of events. Quote, GKN dominated and controlled the immediate aftermarket trading in 8 securities it underwrote so that there was no competitive market for them. As a result, GKN was able to charge excessive markups ranging from 6% to as much as 67% over the prevailing market price in more than 1,500 transactions. At least 90% of these transactions were fraudulent because the markup exceeded 10%. The man and his team knew SPACs though, which is apparently why Early Bird hired him and many of his former coworkers when they wanted to relaunch the industry. So, in 2003, Early Bird launched Millstream Acquisition Corp. The S1 looks a little bit different than they do these days. Units are priced at $6 each and they consist of 1 share of common stock and what would these days be an unheard of 2 warrants per unit with an exercise price of $5. Yes, that is correct. The warrant conversion price is less than the cash in trust. This first SPAC of the new millennium successfully merged with Nations Health. Other notable SPACs from that time included those that merged with Jamba Juice and American Apparel. Again though, SPACs were not a good investment. As Dimitrova 2017 states after looking at 73 merged SPACs, quote, the performance for the 2-year period following the merger completion is even worse, with an average buy and hold return of negative 56.3% compared with a 1.4% return on the market. Those numbers are so bad they're almost unbelievable. Then again, Nations Health was bought out for 12 cents per share, a far cry from the $6 per unit trust value it started with. The early aughts SPAC bubble burst along with all other asset classes in the subsequent recession. During this time, SPAC deals disappeared for the exact opposite reason they did in the late 1990s. Money was so tight that there was none to go around for traditional IPOs, never mind SPACs. Now, we're in the middle of the latest and greatest resurgence. A few hugely successful SPACs have shifted perceptions on the type of company that would commit to listing via SPAC. This has created a virtuous circle of stronger and stronger companies choosing this method and merging with companies that have better and more notable management teams. It's no longer necessarily just a way for small companies that might struggle to launch a traditional IPO. Instead, it's a more efficient way to gain access to capital, and plus it allows the company being acquired more bargaining power over pricing. The family tree of SPACs. Companies carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody knows what it is littered with scams and malinvestment. This time, it's different though. Right? The fact that WeWork would likely be a company right now had it committed to a SPAC rather than an IPO isn't the best endorsement. And it does seem like an awful lot of companies with zero projected near-term revenue are using this route to attain extremely high valuations. Oh, and yesterday, modern SPAC darling Nikola was accused of pushing a truck down a hill and pretending that it was running on hydrogen. So I guess SPAC is dead. Long live the SPAC. Thanks for watching, guys.